You wake just as the light slips between the wooden shutters, soft and pink and far too gentle for what you feel. The linen beneath you is damp with sweat and something else. Your body, sore in strange new ways, refuses to move at first. You lie still, listening to the distant chatter of roosters and merchants down in the agora somewhere nearby. A donkey brays. In the quiet of your new husband's house, there is no sound except for the faint crackle of dying coals in the brazier. You are not in your childhood bed anymore. You are not a girl anymore. Last night was your wedding night. The ceremony was brief but rigid, an exchange of wine and words. A few coins passed between fathers. Then came the room, the locking of the door, the silence that filled everything, and the weight of what was expected. No one told you how it would feel, not really. You were told to be still, to be clean, to be worthy of the linens your husband would show his household come morning. There is movement outside your chamber, the rustle of sandals, the soft grunt of someone bending low. Then the door opens. A woman steps in, not young, not old, but firm in posture and face. Her tunic is stained at the knees, and her hands are strong, hardened from long years of work. She carries a shallow bronze bowl, steaming gently, and a linen cloth folded twice over. She doesn't introduce herself. She doesn't ask permission. She kneels beside you and begins her task. She is a midwife, but not for a birth. She has come to inspect, to confirm. You feel your cheeks flush, but you do not protest. You were told this would happen. The midwife says nothing as she wipes between your legs, examining the cloth. She peers at the sheets, eyes narrowing. At last, she nods once, satisfied. She will tell the household what they want to hear. You were a virgin. Your husband did his duty. You are now fully and legally his. You sit up slowly after she leaves, wrapping a woolen himatayan around your bare shoulders. The room is spare and cold, built of stone and covered in thin plaster, with little decoration except a crude painting of Demeter near the doorway. The gods are always watching, even in rooms like this, especially in rooms like this. The morning light catches on a small amphora beside the brazier. You pour yourself a little water and sip it slowly, carefully. Your thighs ache. The smell of last night still lingers faintly in the air. Wine, oil, sweat, and blood. There is no mention of tenderness, no memory of warmth. Your husband said little. He performed what was expected and turned over to sleep. You lay awake beside him, counting the cracks in the ceiling, wondering if this is what marriage feels like for all women. Voices echo outside the room, two men speaking in calm, detached tones. You recognize your husband's voice, measured, matter-of-fact. He is likely discussing the dowry, or perhaps already speaking of heirs. He has not come to see you yet. You do not expect him to. You are a task fulfilled, a form completed, a contract sealed with blood. The midwife's nod carries more weight than anything you might say or feel. In this world, your body speaks louder than your voice, but not in the way you'd like. It is not your pleasure that matters. It is proof that you were pure, proof that you are fertile, proof that you can be shaped into what the polis expects of a good wife. You move to the window, pulling aside the shutter. Below, the street is beginning to stir. A woman herds goats past your doorway, and a vendor calls out the price of figs. The city is waking, and yet it feels impossibly far away. You are now inside, behind the walls, the veil, and the expectation. Your days will be spent here, managing servants, bearing children, weaving wool. You think of your mother, who cried the night before your wedding, though she never told you why. She said you would understand soon. You think, perhaps, you do. A good woman is modest, obedient, and above all, silent. But there are other women in Athens, women who speak, who laugh, who drink. You've heard their names spoken in whispers. Hetairai, not wives, not mothers, but something else entirely. They are allowed to want. The old servant who helped you bathe yesterday had once worked in a house where one such woman visited. She said the Hetairai were educated, wore perfume, and sometimes chose their own lovers. The men brought them to symposia, the private banquets, where women like you were not welcome. In those rooms, there was music and poetry, and sometimes pleasure. You can hardly picture it. In this world, desire is not yours to hold. In this house, your silence is your virtue. What those other women have is dangerous, so you've been told. Your husband enters without a word. He glances at you, not unkindly, but with the detachment of a man regarding a well-made vessel. You lower your eyes instinctively. He sets down a small scroll on the table, turns, and walks back out. It is as if you are a chair or a walla, useful thing, but not something he would think to speak to unless necessary. You wonder if he will return tonight. You wonder if this is what the next year will be, or the next 10. You are to become a mother. You are expected to be content with that. The midwife had said something strange before she left. Keep yourself calm, she warned. The womb listens. You had nodded, not knowing what she meant, but the words settle now in your mind like dust. You've heard the stories. If a woman desires too much, if she feels too deeply, the womb can grow restless. It can move. It can wander through the body, pressing on the heart, the lungs, the brain. It can make you sick. It can drive you mad. And so, they say, it must be tamed, kept still, through obedience, childbearing, and the denial of pleasure. The Greeks do not just ignore the female orgasm. They fear it. You curl back beneath your blanket, even though the sun is rising. The household is alive now. Voices echoing down the corridor, footsteps across the stone floor. You are not expected to join them yet. You close your eyes, and in the quiet dark, you begin to understand the rules of this life. You may feel, but only in silence. You may speak, but only what is necessary. You may want, but never too much. Because deep down, beneath all the ceremony and custom, lies a quiet terror that no one will name. The fear that your body, left to its own desires, might be more powerful than they can allow. The Greeks believed in balance of nature, of the cosmos, of the soul. The word for it was soufrosina, calm, and self-controlled harmony between the emotions and the intellect, the passions and the body. This wasn't just a philosophical ideal. It was the framework for life. A person who lacked balance was considered not only foolish, but dangerous. And in the Greek mind, no force in nature was more likely to tip the scales into chaos than female desire. It was not simply misunderstood, was disruptive, irrational, potentially ruinous, and so it had to be managed, subdued, hidden behind veils and within walls, not because it was weak, but because it was powerful in ways that frightened them. From the temples of Delphi to the shaded courts of Athens, Greek philosophers, doctors, and lawmakers tried to codify the world. They classified the stars, named diseases, calculated ratios of the human face, and weighed virtue like silver in a balance. But in all this symmetry, the female body posed a puzzle. It did not behave according to the same laws. It bled without injury, conceived without visible transformation, and seemed to hunger for something invisible. And when it found pleasure, true unbidden pleasure, it upset their understanding of order. A man's desire, the Greeks believed, was linear, predictable, noble even, but a woman's, it was circular, tidal, tied to the moon, the seasons, and the ungraspable rhythms of nature. To them, that made it dangerous. The gods themselves reflected this tension. The Olympian pantheon was filled with wild, sexual energy. Zeus, king of the gods, transformed into bulls, swans, golden rainal, to seduce or seize mortal women. Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire, emerged fully formed from sea foam, irresistible and untamable. Yet even she was feared as much as worshipped. Her influence could spark wars, as it did with Helen of Troy. Her favor could intoxicate or destroy. In myths, women who pursued pleasure often ended in ruin. Medea, Phaedra, Calypso all punished in some way for stepping beyond the passive role of the chaste wife. The myths made clear what the philosophers merely implied. Female sexuality could unravel the world. This belief wasn't confined to temples and scrolls, it bled into every corner of life. From a young age, girls were taught not only to obey, but to withdraw. Their bodies were shielded, their voices kept low. A respectable woman did not speak in the marketplace, did not dine with men, did not walk alone. Her honor reduce was bound to her silence and invisibility. Even laughter could be suspect. It was said that a woman who laughed too freely might be thinking improper thoughts. A woman who smiled at a stranger might be inviting shame. So she learned to lower her eyes, to speak in whispers, to lock her pleasure in the innermost chamber of her being, and forget where she left the key. Medical texts from the classical period reflected these anxieties in clinical terms. Hippocratic physicians wrote of the wandering womb, a condition in which the uterus, unsatisfied by sex or childbearing, moved about the body, causing suffocation, anxiety, or madness. The treatment, controlled sexual activity, ever too much, never too little, and always with the goal of pregnancy. Female arousal, if acknowledged at all, was described in terms of disease. If a woman expressed desire, it was evidence of an imbalance, something to be corrected. The idea of women pursuing sex for their own pleasure, not to heal their wombs, not to bear sons, was almost unthinkable. Where it was acknowledged, it was pathetic. Even language reflected this caution. The Greek word for orgasm ecstacisment, to stand outside oneself, a loss of control, of self, of reason. In religious contexts, it referred to divine rapture, the moment when one was taken over by the gods. But in the context of sex, it was unnerving. For a man to experience ecstasy in the arms of a woman was natural. But for a woman to reach such a state suggested something unnatural, possession, hysteria, or defiance. Pleasure, in this sense, was not just a physical act. It was a departure from order. And for women, that departure was especially suspect. In daily life, this fear translated into control. Athenian women married young Aphan by 14 and were expected to produce children quickly. They lived much of their lives indoors, managing the household and avoiding public scrutiny. When sex occurred, it was rarely on their terms. Their pleasure, if it happened at all, was accidental, irrelevant. Some women, perhaps, learned to find joy in the touch of a kind husband or the rhythm of ritual. But that joy had no space in the public language. There were no love poems written by respectable wives. There were no statues of women in rapture. The culture had no place for a woman's pleasure, because it could not be measured, explained, or trusted. And yet, despite all these efforts to restrain and contain it, female desire did not vanish. It appeared in the margins, in jokes, in satire, in scandal. It appeared in whispered stories about courtesans who delighted their lovers and chose their company. It surfaced in the few surviving poems of Sappho, who wrote not of shame, but of longing, heat, and aching joy. These were the fragments that endured, despite centuries of suppression. The Greeks may have feared the female orgasm, but they could never fully erase it. It lingered, soft and insistent, just beneath the surface of their polished marble world. You, sitting at the window in your husband's house, may not know the word ecstasy, but you understand the feeling of being contained, of being shaped by silence. And somewhere, deep in your chest, you feel the first small tug of rebellion, not loud, not dangerous, not yet, just a question. What if there is more than this? What if your body remembers something the world would rather you forget? A story written not in law or myth, but in the soft, quiet heat of knowing what it means to want, and what it might mean, one day, to be allowed to feel. In the shaded courtyards of ancient Athens, stories moved from mouth to mouth, woven as tightly into daily life as the looms in the women's quarters. One of the most persistent was the tale of the wandering womb, whispered by midwives, murmured among mothers, and scribbled down by physicians. It offered a medical theory with spiritual dread, that the female womb was a living thing, a restless, hungry creature that when left unsatisfied could roam the body like a ghost trapped in flesh. It could rise to the lungs and suffocate, press against the heart and cause grief, crawl upward into the brain and unravel the mind. This was not merely metaphor to the Greeks. It was a truth, one that explained women's sorrows, fainting fits, hysteria, and madness. The root of this fear lay in a culture that did not understand it. Unlike the male anatomy, which was visible, external, and therefore more easily categorized, the female reproductive system was veiled in mystery. What was unseen was suspect. Greek physicians, lacking tools of dissection or anatomical knowledge as we know it today, filled the gaps with imagination. They believed the womb had autonomy, that it thirsted for seed, and if denied it, would rebel. Thus, marriage and regular intercourse were not only societal duties, but prescriptions against illness. Virginity, widowhood, and even prolonged abstinence were thought dangerous hazards, not just to the soul, but to the sanity. It was a woman's destiny, according to the likes of Hippocrates, to marry young and often, and to become pregnant soon after. Childbearing was viewed as both a sacred function and a form of medical maintenance. Labor pains, they said, were the body's way of releasing pent-up tension. Menstruation was a purgation of excess humors, and the orgasm myth acknowledged at all was tolerated only insofar as it aided conception, to enjoy it for itself. That was indulgent, even corrupting. A woman who sought pleasure without intent to conceive was seen as diseased, her womb greedy and unmoored. The physical symptoms of so-called hysteria, breathlessness, tremors, anxiety, were simply her uterus in revolt. This belief had real consequences. In upper-class homes, women were often married off before they had even begun to menstruate. Their value was tied to fertility, their identity to the womb. If a woman failed to conceive, she was assumed to be frigid or ill-tempered. If she wept or refused her husband's touch, she was not understood, but treated. Remedies were prescribed, herbal poultices, scented oils, and even aromatic fumigations, meant to lure the womb back to its proper place. In one chilling method, Sweet-smelling herbs were placed near the woman's nose, and foul odors near her lower parts, to entice the wayward uterus to descend. The image was almost comical, except that it reflected a deep cultural discomfort with the female body and its perceived power. Outside the physician's chamber, the myth of the wandering womb echoed in the fears of husbands and fathers. They warned daughters to remain pure, as though the very structure of their bodies might betray them. Wives who grew melancholic or angry were not consoled, but corrected. And pleasure, spontaneous, self-directed pleasure, was seen as an invitation to chaos. In private, women whispered among themselves about their symptoms, their longings, the strange hollowness that sometimes seized them. But these murmurs rarely became more. The dominant view held strong. A woman's body must be filled, subdued, occupied. Otherwise, it might turn against itself. Yet, for all this dread, the Greeks also sensed, dimly, the power they were trying to suppress. The womb was not merely a vessel, it was a force, capable of creation, yes, but also of destruction. Myths abounded of women whose bodies defied their roles. Medea, who bore children and then slaughtered them in rage. Helen, whose beauty and passion tore a continent apart. Even Demeter, the mother goddess herself, plunged the world into winter when her daughter was taken from her. In each case, the female body was not passive, it reacted, demanded, punished. The womb, in these stories, was not content to stay still. And so Greek society doubled down, philosophy echoed medicine. Plato described the female reproductive organs as a living animal within another animal. Aristotle, though more measured, still framed women as incomplete men, their bodies designed for reception, not initiative. This reinforced the idea that female sexuality needed guidance. Left to itself, it strayed, it wandered, it disobeyed. And in a world built on hierarchy, order, and civic control, there was no room for such deviation. A woman's pleasure, therefore, had to be either denied or domesticated. Even in religion, the message was consistent. The goddesses most revered were either virginal Athena, Artemis, or defined by their roles as mothers, like Hera. Those few, like Aphrodite, who embodied lust and sensuality, were worshipped with unease. Temples to her were often placed near ports and brothels, as though her influence needed to be contained near the edges of society. Rituals to honor her sometimes involved sacred prostitutes, women whose sexuality was seen as divine but also dangerous. These priestesses, too, walked a tightrope, venerated yet shunned, powerful yet isolated. You sit now in your quiet room, feeling the ache still lingering in your hips, and the strange emptiness that follows a night where your body was used but not met. You remember the midwife's warning. The womb listens. You wonder if it does, if it has heard your confusion, your fear, your unshed grief. You wonder what it would do if left to its own rhythm, its own desire. Would it rebel? Would it wander? Or would it remember a different kind of power, one the world has long tried to forget? In the stillness, your breath deepens, and somewhere inside you, something stirs. Not pain, not longing, just the first flicker of awareness that you, too, are a force, and you have not yet been named. In the smoky courtyard of a physician's home, a group of men gathers to speak of ailments. They are not patients, but thinkers, observers of humors, of bile and blood, of what they believe makes a body healthy and a soul just. A servant girl brings water in a bronze crater. Her head bowed, she is not addressed. The men speak in calm, analytical tones of illness, fertility, and disorder. Their conclusions will shape not only medicine, but law, ethics, and the fate of every woman in Athens. And yet not one of them has seen the inside of a womb. Greek medicine, though often celebrated for its rationality, was rooted in metaphor and hierarchy. Physicians like Hippocrates and Galen described the body not through empirical discovery, but through analogy. A healthy man, they wrote, was warm and dry, composed of balanced humors. A woman, by contrast, was cool and moist, her internal landscape swampy and unstable. She was less complete, more porous, and more prone to excess. Where male anatomy was external and understood, the female body remained hidden, internal an enigma. That which was hidden, they reasoned, must be governed. And so, medicine became not just a practice of healing, but a system of containment. In this schema, the womb became central not as a sacred source of life, but as a volatile organ requiring constant supervision. The uterus, they claimed, was like an animal. It moved, it craved, it reacted. Without the presence of seed, it became agitated, suffocating the woman from within. Doctors recorded symptoms: anxiety, dizziness, paralysis, choking fits. The diagnosis was almost always the same: hysteria, womb disorder, imbalance, and the cure, penetration, followed by pregnancy. This was not about pleasure. It was about obedience to form, to duty. The idea of a woman seeking sexual fulfillment for herself was as absurd as suggesting that fire might yearn for water. Treatments for women, then, were both clinical and symbolic. Herbal compresses were applied not to soothe, but to manipulate the uterus. Perfumes and smoke were used to chase it into place. The patient's pleasure was not only irrelevant, it was a liability. Doctors warned against letting women grow too fond of their own arousal. It could lead to swelling, to uterine disorder, to delusions of independence. Even midwives, who had closer knowledge of the body, were bound by these beliefs. They helped deliver babies, yes, but also enforced rituals of cleanliness, silence, and submission. When they whispered advice to young brides, it was often about how not to feel. These ideas seeped beyond the physician's chamber into the courts and councils of law. In Athens, a woman's testimony held little weight unless corroborated by a man. Her memory, like her body, was seen as unreliable. If she committed adultery, it was presumed to be a result of excess desire. If she refused her husband, it was grounds for suspicion. Even within the family, medical theories were used to justify control. Fathers arranged marriages to regulate daughters' health. Husbands limited their wives' movements to avoid emotional overstimulation. A woman's life was charted as a sequence of medical milestones: menstruation, defloration, pregnancy, menopause. Each stage carried its own warnings, its own constraints. In some circles, philosophers attempted to elevate these ideas into metaphysical truths. Plato wrote that the womb was an animal longing to generate children, which, when unfulfilled, could become restless. Aristotle described the female as a deficient male, her organs inward, her essence passive. From this logic came the moral framework. If a woman sought pleasure, it was an unnatural reversal of order. It was man's role to act, hers to receive. In denying her the right to want, they claimed to preserve harmony, but in truth they feared what they could not measure. This suppression did not extinguish desire, it displaced it. In the margins of literature, we see glimmers of recognition. Comic poets joked nervously about women who lusted like men. Vase paintings depicted scenes of female arousal, often exaggerated. always undercut by satire. Even in the myths, pleasure emerges, but it is never uncomplicated. Echo pines for Narcissus, and fades to nothing. Phaedra's passion destroys a kingdom. The message is clear. When women feel too much, they unravel the world. And so, medicine functioned less as a science than as a moral architecture. Its purpose was not merely to heal, but to affirm what society already believed. That women were to be guided, not listened to. That their bodies were sites of potential danger. That their orgasm, if it existed, must be tethered to childbearing or extinguished altogether. These beliefs would echo for centuries, passed from Greek temples to Roman forums, from medieval monasteries to modern clinics. The language would change, but the suspicion remained. You sit now by a shallow basin, your hands submerged in warm water as you rinse linens no one will praise. Your husband has gone to speak with the physician about the best time to try again. You overheard the words, "She must be healthy, she must bear sons." No one asks how you feel. The midwife told you, kindly enough, that you must not resist. It will go easier if you do not think, but your body is not a beast. It does not wait to be ruled. Somewhere inside you, far below the silence, a question remains. What if your desire is not an illness, but a memory? What if pleasure is not disorder, but knowledge, buried beneath 1,000 years of fear? The home of a respectable Athenian woman was a world within walls. Its boundaries were physical and moral, reinforced by marble and silence. Here, within the gynaecinitis, the women's quarters, life was regulated by routine and expectation. There were rooms for spinning, for weaving, for managing the daily stores of grain and oil. A courtyard where slaves drew water and children played in shadows. But nowhere was there space for a woman to be seen. Visibility was risk, exposure was shame. The house was protection, yes, but also prison. And within it, a woman's desire was expected to sleep as quietly as she did. From birth, daughters were groomed for this cloistered existence. They learned to walk without sound, to speak without raising their eyes. They were taught modesty in motion, in dress, in thought. Even laughter was measured. To be desirable was a hazard. To be undisciplined was ruin. Girls played near the loom and watched their mothers bargain quietly with slave women. They heard stories of gods and monsters, of Helen and her 1,000 ships, of wives who failed to obey and brought dishonor. And always there was the whisper, a woman who reaches beyond her place destroys the harmony of the home. Marriage was the threshold. It occurred not at the height of womanhood, but at its beginning, 14, 13, sometimes younger. She was handed over by her father, like a property transfer, her dowry as much a legal bond as an offering. The husband might be twice her age or more. He had seen the agora, the gymnasium, the symposium. She had seen only the inner walls of her childhood home, and so she crossed into another set of rooms, larger, perhaps, but no freer. The husband would visit at night, speak of sons, and disappear by morning. If she was dutiful, she would bear children. If she was quiet, she would be praised. If she was obedient, her name might never leave the house at all. The veil was not just a garment, it was a symbol. When a woman went outside and only for funerals, festivals, or to visit another house with a chaperone, she covered herself entirely, hair, face, body. The veil announced to the world, I am claimed, I am untouchable. To appear unveiled before a man who was not family was an offense. In the law courts, such women were sometimes accused of inviting sin. Even statues of women showed them wrapped tightly in cloth, modestly gazing downward. Art reflected not reality, but aspiration. The perfect woman, to the Greeks, was invisible. But within these rules, a contradiction simmered. For though the ideal woman was silent and still, the culture still needed her to perform her function reproduction. She was expected to welcome her husband, to bear his children, to manage the household. And yet, any sign of passion, any pleasure on her part, was considered dangerous. The Greeks wanted fertility without desire, motherhood without sensuality. They demanded that a woman's body open itself, while her mind remained closed. This paradox shaped her entire existence. If she showed resistance, she was frigid. If she showed joy, she was lustful. The narrow line between them was patrolled by husbands, mothers, law, and servants who watched and whispered. Stories reinforced the boundary. In one tale, a wife who dared to gaze too long at a flute girl was accused of corruption and cast out. In another, a husband arranged for his wife to be tested by watching a play. If she laughed too freely, she was to be dismissed. Even within marriage, desire was suspect. The myth of Pandora lingered as a warning woman, as the bearer of chaos. Her curiosity a curse upon the world. She had opened the box, after all. She had unleashed sickness, envy, and desire. Even hope, the last thing in the jar, was ambiguous. Was it comfort or a trick to prolong suffering? And so, the house was built around these ideas, to contain, to guard, to shield. A woman's days were filled with ritual, with chores that blurred the hours. She baked bread, she boiled linen, she wove complex patterns into woolen cloaks. Her pleasure, if liquored, had nowhere to go. She might press her thighs together at night, feel a heat she didn't understand, and swallow it like a secret. To speak of it would be madness. To seek it out, ruin. Only the Hetiri could name such feelings, and they did so from outside the veil, outside the law, in a world she could never touch. Sometimes, she wondered, not loudly, not often, just in the quiet moments, before the oil lamp was trimmed and the shutters drawn, she might recall the way the flute girl's hands moved over the strings, the way a woman at the festival had laughed, her head thrown back without fear. She might imagine what it would be like to feel without shame, not to love her husband, perhaps, but to be allowed to want, not to be taken, but to reach. In those moments, she did not cry out, but her body remembered. Beneath the veil, beneath the silence, a pulse remained. Tonight, as the shadows lengthen, she moves through the house like a wraith. She pours wine for her husband, lowers her eyes, folds the linen with care. She listens to the sound of men's voices through the wall. They speak of politics, of trade, of war. No one speaks of her. And yet, behind her quiet movements, something hums. Not defiance, not yet. But the knowledge that inside her, something stirs, something not broken, something not ashamed. And though the house is sealed tight against the night, her breath is steady, and her gaze lingers just a moment longer at the open window. Beyond the quiet walls of the household, beyond the veil and the silence, there existed another kind of womana, shadow sister to the obedient wife. She was the Hetira. She walked unveiled, spoke in measured tones, laughed at men's jokes, and was sometimes cleverer than the men themselves. She could recite lines from Homer, play the lyre, debate matters of love and state, and pour wine with grace. And most unsettling of Alshay, was allowed to enjoy herself. In the Athenian imagination, the Hetira was not only a companion, but a contradiction. She was woman, unbound, and for that reason, she was both desired and despised. Hetiri, were not prostitutes in the sense we understand today. They were companions, courtesans, intellectuals, and artists. They trained for years to cultivate beauty, wit, and skill. Some were born into it, daughters of other hetairai, or of medics foreigners, living in Athens without full citizenship. Others were once slaves, educated by their owners to entertain powerful men. They were not permitted to marry citizens, but they attended symposia, performed in private salons, and engaged in love affairs that shaped the destinies of politicians and poets. They were not confined to the gynekinus. Their sphere was the symposium, the couch, the mindand, sometimes the heart. Within these rooms of laughter and wine, they found a strange kind of power. A hetairai could discuss politics with Pericles, perform for Plato, and share a bed with a general. She could shape a man's opinions, comfort his defeats, and celebrate his victories. Some became wealthy, owning their own homes, managing their own affairs. A few even commissioned temples or left behind inscriptions, but their freedom came at a price. They lived on the margins of respectability. They were revered in private, but scorned in public. Wives were told not to mention them. Daughters were warned not to become them. Yet, despite this, many men saw in hetairai what they could not find in their wives: conversation, intellect, sensuality. The wife was for children, and the home, the hetairai, was for companionship and joy. In this cultural divide, the female orgasm found its narrow refuge. Among the hetairai, pleasure could be acknowledged, briefly, playfully, never too seriously. Desire could be theatrical, controlled, a performance to match the evening's wine. But even here, it was often more about the man's fantasy than the woman's truth. A hetairai might moan softly, smile beneath half-lidded eyes, speak of longing. But whether she truly felt it, whether she was allowed to feel, it was another question entirely. Still, they left behind traces. In vase paintings, we see reclining women, their hair unbound, their bodies poised between movement and stillness. In the fragments of ancient comedy, hetairai deliver sharp, lascivious lines, mocking men's fumbling gestures, and in a few rare texts there are hints, slight, shimmering, of their inner lives. One such woman, the famed Aspasia, companion to Pericles, was known not just for her beauty, but for her intellect. Socrates himself is said to have admired her mind. Another, Neaera, found herself on trial for living too much like a wife, proof that even imitation of a citizen woman was a threat to the social order. For the average Athenian woman, these figures were at once scandalous and fascinating. A wife might never speak of them aloud, but she knew their names. She might see them at the festival of Dionysus, cloaked in color, dancing and laughing, as though the gods themselves had blessed their freedom. She might wonder what it was like to be touched not as a duty, but as a delight. She might imagine a world where a woman's pleasure was not feared, but shared. These thoughts were not allowed to linger. They passed like smoke, ungraspable, but they passed through nonetheless. The presence of the hetairai created a paradox. They embodied all the qualities that Athenian men claimed to value: intelligence, beauty, sensuality, yet those same qualities made them dangerous. They were a mirror turned toward the patriarchy, reflecting its contradictions back at itself. If a woman could be charming, wise, and sexually confident, then what did that say about the enforced silence of wives? What did it say about the claim that female pleasure was a threat? The hetairai made visible what was otherwise buried, that a woman's desire did not always need to be controlled. Sometimes it could be chosen. You lie in your bed tonight. listening to the faint laughter of men returning from a symposium. The sound is distant, filtered through courtyards and closed doors. You imagine the rooms where they've been, the golden light of oil lamps, the low music, the scent of saffron and smoke. You picture her, the Hetera, her eyes lined with kohl, her lips parted, her voice low and sure. You do not envy her, not exactly. Her life is uncertain, her place always precarious. But you think about how she speaks, how she laughs, how she touches and is touched without shame. And you wonder what it would be like, just once, to be seen in full light and not in shadows. In this city of rules and rituals, she lives as both exception and threat. You live as rule. She has a name the poets remember. You have a name only your children will carry forward. But in the dark, both of you dream. And in those dreams, you are not wife or courtesan. You are whole. You are awake. And for a moment, the veil between your world and hers feels thin enough to slip through. High upon the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where the wind cuts through olive groves and the marble stones shimmer under the midday sun, stands the temple of Apollo. Pilgrims come from across the Greek world to kneel before its steps, seeking answers to questions they dare not ask in their own homes. They offer honey cakes, coins, and laurel wreaths to the god of light and prophecy. But it is not Apollo who speaks to them. It is a woman, the Pythia seated above a chasm, breathing in sweet-smelling fumes. Her words slow and strange. She is the voice of the divine. And like all women who hold knowledge, her power comes with suspicion. The Pythia was not chosen for her beauty or her charm. She was often an older woman, once a virgin, then ritually purified. She lived apart from men and bathed in sacred springs. On appointed days, she would descend into the Adyton, the inner chamber of the temple, and seat herself upon the tripod over a fissure in the earth. There, she inhaled vapors, perhaps ethylene, or maybe just incense, and entered a trance. Her words, fragmented and obscure, would be interpreted by priests. And yet, the people believed she spoke directly for Apollo. In a world where women's opinions were suspect, here was one whose voice shaped the fate of empires. There is an irony here that does not go unnoticed. In most corners of Greek life, a woman's thoughts were unwelcome, her emotions treated as suspect. But when those same thoughts were claimed to come from the gods, they became revered. The Greeks did not trust women to speak as themselves, but they would listen if they believed the words were not theirs. And the Pythia was not the only one. Across the ancient world, female seers, oracles, and prophetesses offered insight into war, love, birth, and death. They were feared and sought out, revered and isolated. Their wisdom came with a price, a life of chastity, solitude, or madness. Myths reinforced this uneasy reverence. Consider Cassandra, gifted with prophecy by Apollo, but cursed when she refused his advances. No one would believe her visions, no matter how true. Or the Sibyl of Cumae, who lived for 1,000 years but withered slowly, her body crumbling while her voice endured. Or Tiresias, the prophet who lived as both man and woman, and claimed to know that women experience more pleasure. For this insight, Hera struck him blind. Again and again, the stories suggest the same thing. When women speak truth, especially sexual truth, they are punished. These figures stood outside the roles of wife or courtesan. They did not marry nor serve at symposia. Their sexual energy was redirected, sublimated into divine service. But it was always there, lurking beneath the surface. The Pythia's trance, her trembling voice, her flushed skin, these were described in almost erotic terms. To be possessed by the god was not unlike being taken by a man. The Greek language blurred the lines. Ecstasis to stand outside oneself was the word used for both orgasm and divine possession. A woman overcome by pleasure and a woman overcome by the divine were equally mysterious and equally feared. The temple itself reflected this tension. Statues of Apollo young, strong, pure lined the sanctuary, while female forms were often hidden, abstract, veiled. The Pythia's body was present but inaccessible. She could speak, but only in riddles. She could move, but only in prescribed ways. Her physical presence was central to the ritual, yet she was always interpreted, never believed directly. This mirrored the cultural treatment of female desire more broadly: present, powerful, but denied agency, allowed to exist, but only through a male framework. Yet these women endured. They held power in ways no wife or hetera could. Kings waited for their words. Armies paused at their command. And though their lives were tightly controlled, they carved out a space where female experience, however distorted, could be expressed. Even in ritual, they were reminders that the female body held a mystery the Greeks could not solve. That mystery was both sacred and threatening, and so they were revered, but always at a distance. You hear stories of the oracle whispered by servants. They say she speaks in tongues, that the god enters her like wind through trees. Some say she knows when a woman is with child before the belly swells. Others say she can name the moment of your death. You wonder if she ever speaks of joy, if the god tells her what it feels like to be touched and seen and known. You wonder if she envies the women who live simpler lives, or if she pities them. Perhaps, from her high seat above the chasm, she sees all of you the same, wandering souls in veiled bodies, all waiting for a truth no one dares speak aloud. In the dark, you dream of her, not the god, but the woman, her hair unbound, her mouth open, her voice low and sure. You do not understand her words, but they settle inside you like heat, and when you wake, you feel not fear, but clarity. Somewhere within you, too, is a voice. It does not speak in riddles. It does not need permission. It waits, quiet, patient, and real. She rose from the sea, fully formed, a vision of impossible beauty. Born not of womb or mother, but from the foam of the waves, where Uranus's severed parts had fallen. Aphrodite emerged as the embodiment of love, desire, and the irresistible pull of the body. She was not a goddess of marriage, nor of family, nor even of fertility in the traditional sense. She was the goddess of pleasure for its own sake, unshackled from duty or design. And in a world where female desire was meant to be hidden, Aphrodite was a provocation, a force the Greeks could not control. They built temples to her. They offered her figs, incense, and doves, but they did so with caution, because her gifts, once given, could not be returned. Aphrodite was not just lovely, she was powerful. She could bend gods to her will, reduce kings to fools, start wars with a glance. Her presence stirred longing in mortals and immortals alike. And yet, her worship often occurred in marginal spaces, ports, brothels, the outskirts of town. There were grand sanctuaries, yes, like the one at Corinth, where priestesses served her through sacred rites. But her rites were unlike those of Artemis or Athena. They involved nudity, incense, sensual music. Worshippers begged for beauty, for love, for favor in erotic matters. The line between prayer and seduction was thin, and in that space, female sexuality was not just present, it was divine. But the Greeks feared what they worshipped. Aphrodite's power was acknowledged, even necessary, but never safe. She was seen as capricious, easily offended, and quick to punish. In myth, her wrath was often triggered by those who denied her realm. The hunter Hippolytus, who devoted himself to chaste Artemis and rejected the power of love, was destroyed by her hand. His stepmother, Phaedra, was cursed to fall madly in love with him. Her desire, twisted by divine will, led to madness and death. These stories served as warnings. Resist Aphrodite and suffer. Embrace her and be consumed. For women, Aphrodite was both inspiration and threat. She represented a kind of freedom they could not claim. A woman who acted on her own desire, who demanded satisfaction, who took pleasure seriously, but she was also a reminder of the cost. Helen, her favored daughter, brought ruin to Troy with her beauty. Medea, in some versions, was tied to Aphrodite's influence, as well her passion, so intense it led to betrayal and bloodshed. The myths linked female desire to destruction, framing it as a force that unraveled the fabric of civilization. To feel deeply, to want openly, was to invite divine punishment. Even in her gentler stories, Aphrodite's power was never separate from danger. She loved Ares, god of war, passion, and violence entwined. She deceived Hephaestus, her lawful husband, making a mockery of marriage. She favored lovers who were beautiful but fragile, Adonis, whose death she could not prevent, Anchises, who was crippled after bragging about lying with her. In each tale, the goddess emerges not just as an ideal, but as a challenge. To love her was to surrender control. To please her was to risk everything. And yet, mortals sought her favor all the same. In her iconography, Aphrodite is often depicted nude, not just uncovered, but inviting. Her nudity is neither shameful nor passive. She looks directly at the viewer, hand raised as if to ask, "Do you see? Do you dare?" And beneath her gaze lies a profound tension. For the Greeks, female nudity was typically a symbol of vulnerability, but Aphrodite's nakedness was armor. It was her domain, her weapon, her truth. She made men tremble, not through force, but through the certainty of her body. She knew what they tried to deny. That desire is not weakness, but power. Wives, of course, were not meant to imitate her. They were to offer modesty, not magnetism. Their desire, if acknowledged at all, was to be tied to the hearth, to the continuation of the family line. A wife who tried to embody Aphrodite might be called shameless, even mad, and yet many prayed to her in secret, for beauty, yes, but also for pleasure, for a moment of freedom in the night, for the courage to feel more than they were allowed. In these whispered prayers, Aphrodite lived not as myth, but as memory, a flicker of what once was, or what could be if only the world were different. You have seen her statue once, in a temple near the water. She was carved in marble, smooth and impossibly soft, her foot poised as though stepping from a bath. You were a child then, holding your mother's hand. She pulled you past quickly, muttering that it was not a place for girls. But you looked back. You remember the tilt of the goddess's head, the curve of her mouth. You did not understand desire, not yet, but you understood awe. Now, years later, lying in the dark beside a man who never asks what you want, you think of her again, not as a warning, as a possibility. You whisper her name not aloud, but in your mind, Aphrodite, not to beg, not to confess, but simply to remember that there is a part of you the world has tried to hide, deny, contain, but it is still there. And though the gods are silent now, the sea still whispers at night. and the wind still carries her scent. One day you think you might return to that temple, not as a wife, not as a shadow, but as a woman who knows what she is worth. In the heart of the Athenian home, the marriage bed stood as both centerpiece and silence. It was often little more than a raised platform with wool-stuffed linen and a carved wooden frame, but it held the weight of generations. It was where girls became wives, where sons were conceived, and where duty was performed in quiet repetition. Marriage, in Athens, was not a bond of affection, it was an arrangement of necessity. Contracts were drawn, dowries exchanged, and family honor secured. The emotional terrain of the union was secondary. Love was a luxury. Pleasure, particularly the wife's, was irrelevant. What mattered was lineage, legacy, and control. Athenian men, schooled in rhetoric and philosophy, rarely brought such conversation home. Their wives were not expected to understand, debate, or engage in wit. They were expected to manage the household, oversee servants, and raise children with discipline and virtue. A good wife was like a good steward, efficient, quiet, invisible. And so, the marriage bed became an extension of this silence. It was not a place of mutual exploration, but of expectation. The husband initiated, the wife endured. Even when tenderness existed, it was often veiled in restraint. Affection was not denied, but rarely spoken. And the idea that the wife might feel desire, might seek, it was almost unthinkable. This disinterest in female pleasure was not born from ignorance alone, but from ideology. Greek thinkers, steeped in hierarchies, believed that a woman's role in sex was to receive. Her body, cool and porous, was designed to be entered. The act was productive only if it resulted in children. Anything beyond that, groans, gasps, a flicker of heat in her chest, was ignored or suppressed. Wives were not to behave like hetairæ. They were not to kiss their husbands passionately or whisper in their ears. Those behaviors belonged to other women. Respectable wives were not supposed to enjoy sex. They were supposed to bear it. This split in expectation shaped every aspect of domestic life. A husband might go to the brothel, the symposium, or to the company of a courtesan. He might share wine, laughter, and longing in those spaces, only to return home and treat his wife with cold decorum. He would never think to ask her what she liked, or if she liked anything at all. Her body was a duty, a place for planting seed, and yet she was held to a strict moral code. Any deviation, any hint of extramarital affection, was a scandal that could ruin not only her life, but her family's name. The law reflected these double standards. An adulterous wife could be divorced immediately, her dowry returned to her father, and her name stained forever. But a husband who kept a mistress or slept with slaves faced no such consequence. It was even considered prudent for men to satisfy their appetites outside marriage, to keep their wives pure and unsullied by lust. The marriage bed then became a stage for restraint, not only on the part of the man, but especially for the woman. Her body could be entered, but her spirit was to remain untouched. And yet, nature does not always obey law. Some wives, in quiet rebellion, found ways to feel, a touch that lingered too long, a whispered thought never spoken aloud, the ache in their bellies that came not from hunger, but from a need they did not name. Some women turned to each other, finding comfort in the press of a hand, the warmth of shared silence. Others imagined while lying in the dark beside their husbands what it would be like to be kissed as if it mattered. These thoughts were dangerous, but they flickered even behind shuttered windows. Medical texts insisted that a woman's orgasm was merely a vessel to assist in conception, if it mattered at all. Some writers even claimed it was unnecessary that seed could take root in stillness. Others, like Galen, noted that women could swell with pleasure, that they might even feel heat. But such observations were buried under cautions. To acknowledge her pleasure was to acknowledge her agency, and that, the Greeks feared, would destabilize the order of things. If a wife knew what she wanted, she might ask for more. She might refuse. She might become something other than obedient. For the woman herself, the experience of sex in marriage often moved through numbness and necessity. She learned to breathe through the discomfort, to hold her thoughts apart. She told herself it was her duty, her fate, that to become a mother was the highest honor, that pleasure was for other women, looser women, women who would never be invited to festivals or honored in the family tomb. And yet, in the deep of night, when the oil lamp flickered and the weight beside her shifted into sleep, she might place a hand on her own stomach and wonder what it meant to want. Tonight you lie awake again. Your husband came and went, as he always does, with the dull efficiency of a man fulfilling a promise he does not care to understand. You did not cry, you did not flinch, you simply endured. And now, alone, you listen to the sound of wind against the shutters and think about the temple of Aphrodite. You remember her lips, her stance, her power. You think of the Hittery, of the oracle, of women who spoke and were heard, even if only briefly. And you wonder, if your body had a voice, what would it say? Would it whisper, or would it scream? You close your eyes and breathe. Not in surrender, not in shame, but in recognition that your silence has weight, that your longing is not a flaw, that somewhere beneath the layers of linen and law, your body still belongs to you. The Greek city-states were not merely collections of homes and temples. They were machines of regulation. They organized labor, war, philosophy, and, perhaps most meticulously, the body. In Athens, law penetrated the most intimate spaces, reaching into the household, the bedroom, the womb. Among the crimes that could ruin a citizen's reputation, few were considered more grave than moichia adultery. But the word did not mean what we assume. It was not the betrayal of trust between two equals. It was the trespassing of another man's property. And within this framework, female desire uncontrolled, unlicensed was not just immoral, it was illegal. Greek law defined adultery narrowly. Only the sexual violation of a married woman counted. A man could visit prostitutes, sleep with slaves, even keep a mistress. These were not considered breaches of public order. But if he touched another man's wife, if he entered a household through seduction or force, then he was guilty of moichia. And the punishment was not simply a private affair, it was public, violent, and shameful. The injured husband was legally entitled to kill the adulterer on the spot, without trial. If he chose mercy, the man could be beaten, fined, or subjected to humiliating rituals. Being shaved, paraded through the agora, or forced to perform acts considered degrading. But what of the wife? She was not killed. She was cast out. A divorced woman could not remarry easily. Her family lost honor. Her children might be disinherited, and she herself became a kind of shadow still living, but diminished. Even if the act was non-consensual, the burden of shame remained. Greek courts rarely entertained the idea of marital rape or of a woman being overpowered. Consent in these contexts was irrelevant. The assumption was that a woman's very presence outside the home invited risk, If she was caught, she was at fault. This harshness reveals more than fear of betrayal. It reveals a deep discomfort with the idea of female autonomy. A woman who sought sex outside of marriage was not just sinning. She was threatening the fabric of civic life. The family unit depended on the certainty of bloodlines. A citizen must know that his son was truly his. The law of adultery, therefore, was a law of control, it said. Her body must not wander, her desire must not speak, her pleasure must never come from anyone but her husband, and, even then, it must remain silent. Yet, history tells us that human longing does not obey statute. Women strayed, sometimes carefully, sometimes with abandon. There are records of women exchanging secret letters, sneaking into festivals, arranging clandestine meetings. A few wealthy women kept lovers among the household slaves. Others fell in love with philosophers, poets, or neighbors. These stories are rare not because they were rare, but because they were erased. Women who lived outside the norm were written out of the civic memory or remembered only as warnings. In tragedy, female infidelity often led to catastrophe. Consider Clytemnestra, who took a lover while Agamemnon was at war, then killed her husband upon his return. Or Phaedra, driven to lust for her stepson by divine intervention, whose false accusation led to his death. These plays did not just entertain, they educated. They taught women what might happen if they allowed desire to bloom. Not only would they suffer, the whole house would fall. Female pleasure, uncontrolled, was portrayed as the spark that set the world ablaze. Still, in quieter corners of literature, there are moments that hint at a different understanding. In the love poetry of Sappho, desire is tender, aching, even mutual. In the comedies of Aristophanes, women conspire for peace through abstinence, wielding their sexuality with intention. In vase paintings, sometimes tucked beneath scenes of myth or battle, a woman gazes at her lover with open longing. These glimpses do not redeem the system, but they suggest that not everyone believed the official story. Some knew that pleasure could be shared, not stolen, that it could be a source of connection, not chaos. For the average Athenian woman, though, these truths had to remain hidden. She learned early to avoid risk, to watch her tone, her step, her glance. A moment of warmth toward a stranger could be seen as an invitation. A visit to the well without an escort could become a scandal. Even a dream, if shared aloud, might stir suspicion. So she folded herself into small movements, into soft words, into silence. She locked her hunger in a room with no door, and when it stirred, she turned her face to the wall. Tonight, you lie beneath a clean linen sheet, the air cool against your skin. You are not guilty of anything. You have done what was asked. You have been faithful, modest, obedient, and yet you feel the pull of something unnamed, a sensation not of sin, but of possibility. It is not a man's touch you crave. It is your own freedom, the freedom to feel without fear, to want without punishment, to exist not as property or risk, but as a person, whole, desiring, and unashamed. The stars flicker overhead. Somewhere in the city, a lawmaker dreams of rules. Somewhere else, a young girl begins to understand the shape of her own body. And here, in this quiet room, you draw breath not in secrecy, but in recognition that your pleasure is not a crime, it is a truth. One the world may fear, but one it cannot erase. In the philosophy schools of Athens, the shaded gardens, where Socrates once walked, the echoing courtyards of the academy there were endless debates about virtue, reason, and the nature of the soul. Here, the great thinkers argued about justice, order, and harmony. They spoke of moderation, of the noble pursuit of truth, and of the ideal forms that lay beyond the material world. But when they turned to the body, and especially to sex, a familiar pattern re-emerged. Pleasure, in the male experience, could be noble. It could be controlled, directed, and philosophical. But female pleasure, untethered, inward, and unseen, was described not as refinement, but as wilderness. Where the male climax was linear and logical, the female orgasm, when acknowledged at all, was tangled in mystery and excess. Plato, in his later dialogues, elevated the idea of love into something nearly divine. In the Symposium, he described Eros as a ladder, beginning with physical attraction, but ascending to the love of wisdom, and finally, the love of pure form. The ideal lover, he argued, was not obsessed with flesh, but with beauty itself. This form of love, often between older men and younger boys, was considered elevating. It was controlled, intellectual, almost sacred. And yet, in these lofty reflections, the female body was notably absent. When women were mentioned, they were treated as a necessary mechanism for reproduction, not as partners in desire. Female sexuality, it seemed, was too messy for philosophy. Aristotle took a more scientific tone. He believed in hierarchy and order, and this extended to gender. Men, he wrote, had more heat, more form, more perfection. Women were cooler, more passive, less complete. Even in biology, he saw the male as the active principle, and the female as the material one. The man's seed carried the essence, the woman merely received. From this, it followed naturally that male pleasure was expressive, potent, and decisive, while female pleasure was incidental, perhaps even distracting. It served no intellectual purpose. It had no civic function. It was something to be managed, like emotion or appetite. This philosophical scaffolding supported the broader cultural ideal that the male body was an instrument of the state, and the female body a vessel of nature. To feel too much was to lose reason. To lose reason was to lose status. For men, pleasure could coexist with logic. A symposiast could drink, flirt, and still quote Homer. A general might take a lover and still lead an army. Male desire was compatible with civilization, but female desire was often likened to madness. In vase paintings and comedic plays, aroused women were shown with wild hair, open mouths, and unrestrained gestures. Their pleasure was not elegant, it was dangerous. This fear of female excess was embedded even in myth. The Maenads, female followers of Dionysus, were said to tear animals limb from limb in ecstatic frenzy. They danced in forests, intoxicated and possessed, their eyes alight with divine madness. The Greeks loved telling stories of what happened when women stepped outside the walls. The result was never peace, it was chaos. The subtext was clear. A woman who surrendered to pleasure became something other than human. She became a threat to the order of things. And yet, men were permitted, expected even to seek sexual fulfillment. In the Symposium, they reclined on couches, sipped diluted wine, and engaged in flirtation with courtesans or boys. They played games of wit, exchanged poems, touched hands beneath the table. This was not vulgar, it was refined, cultural. The male orgasm, stripped of shame, was framed as an act of vitality. It did not threaten his citizenship, it confirmed it. A man who knew pleasure and controlled it was civilized. A woman who knew pleasure and wanted more was barbaric. This dichotomy shaped more than behavior, it shaped identity. Boys were taught that their desires could be stepping stones to manhood if harnessed, if elevated, if refined. Girls were taught to fear theirs, to guard them, to deny them until they vanished into motherhood or old age. A curious boy was a student. A curious girl was a danger to herself. This training ran so deep that many women never questioned it. They measured their virtue by absence of passion, of need, of memory. But some, perhaps, wondered in the quiet of night. They wondered what it would feel like to be kissed without consequence, to open not only the body but the voice, to say, "I want, I feel, I know." These thoughts were brief, quick, as a shadow passing a candle butt. They came, and they lingered. You sit at your loom now, fingers moving through wool, your eyes steady. The house is quiet, and your husband has gone to the bathhouse. On the wall above you hangs a small painting, a gift from his mother, of a noble hero grasping a sword, his muscles taut with glory. You study it, and for the first time you think of the painter. Was it a man who imagined this form, who traced these lines with pride? Did he see in this body a symbol of strength, of purpose? And what would he make of your body so often covered, so often still? Would he paint it? Would he listen to it? You return to your weaving, but the question remains, not a scream, not a rebellion, just a thread that leads inward, toward a part of you no one has ever named, a part that feels not wildly, not shamefully, but deeply. And tonight, when the house is dark, you will sit with that feeling. You will not apologize for it. You will not fear it. You will simply let it be, because you are not a storm. You are not a Maenad. You are a woman, and your pleasure is not madness. It is yours. Night falls on Athens, not with silence, but with music and rising laughter. From the shaded courtyards of the wealthier homes, flickers of torchlight dance behind latticework screens, and the scent of wine, figs, and roasted meat drifts into the streets. The symposium has begun. It is not a party in the casual sense. It is a ritual, a performance, a mirror of the Athenian soul. Here, among cushions and clay goblets, men recline and speak of love, politics, poetry, and power. They drink in measured rounds, play games of flirtation, and summon musicians to soften the air. But one thing remains constant. No wives are present. The symposium is a sanctuary of masculine freedom, and the exclusion of women is no accident. It is a requirement. The symposium was not simply about indulgence. It was about control. Each cup of wine was diluted with water in exact proportions. Each activity had its phase. Conversation came first, then entertainment, then more wine, and only much later, intimacy if it came at all. This structure, refined and repeated, was designed to elevate pleasure into art. The men spoke of philosophy, told myths, praised the virtues of moderation. Yet the deeper truth was more complicated. For while they spoke of virtue, they indulged in flirtations with courtesans. While they praised the mind, they gazed longingly at dancers, at flute girls, at companions trained not only in music, but in how to laugh, listen, and desire on cue. These women were not wives. They were hetairai, courtesans, trained in the art of the symposium. Unlike the wives confined to the gyneconitis, the women here were permitted to speak and expected to please. They wore perfume, cleverness, and silk. They were chosen for their wit as much as for their beauty. And yet, even as they performed the roles that wives could not, they remained outside the sphere of respectability. They could never marry a citizen. They could never bear legitimate children. Their freedom was the coin of their exclusion. For Athenian men, this division of the feminine into categories wife, courtesan, prostitute, virgin allowed them to enjoy sex, without disrupting civic order. The symposium let them explore longing, tenderness, even love, so long as it was with someone the law did not deem sacred. A wife's body was for reproduction, a courtesan's was for pleasure. The Greek world maintained this split with careful rituals, ensuring that desire remained compartmentalized. But beneath the surface, the tension remained. If pleasure was dangerous in wives, why was it allowed, celebrated in others? Why, if female desire was feared, was it so carefully curated? The answer lies in power. The symposium was not only a site of pleasure, but of hierarchy. It affirmed who could speak, who could listen, who could be touched. Male desire was framed as expansive, discerning, a form of learning. Female desire, on the rare occasions it appeared, was depicted as reactive or deceptive. The courtesan might smile, but her smile was always a mask. She pleased to survive, not because she felt, and if she did feel, her feelings were best left unspoken. A woman's real pleasure, after all, would risk unbalancing the carefully crafted ritual. It was enough that she played her part. Outside the walls of the symposium, wives sat in silence. They did not ask where their husbands had gone. They did not ask what flute girls whispered to them in lamplight. They knew they had known since childhood, since the first lesson about modesty, since the first time someone said that a man must sow wild oats before settling down. But knowing was not the same as saying. A woman who complained about her husband's absences was considered jealous, foolish, even unstable, and so she learned to wait, to press down her anger like bread dough, to focus on the loom, on the child, on the tasks that dulled the ache. Some wives dreamed of the symposium not for the wine or the games, but for the voices, for the chance to speak in company, to laugh without suspicion, to be regarded not just as a function, but as a person. Some imagined what it would be like to sit among those reclining men and share a poem of their own, to lean forward and be listened to raise a cup not in servitude, but in joy. These dreams were small and fleeting, quickly smothered by the weight of the day, but they returned in the quiet hours when the house was still and the fire had gone low. You sit alone tonight, your fingers tracing the rim of a ceramic bowl. Your husband has gone to a gathering. He told you it was business, but you know better. He will drink and speak and perhaps touch someone who is allowed to be touched. You do not weep, you do not rage, you simply sit with the knowledge. And as the shadows stretch across the stone floor, you wonder what it would be like to speak as freely as those men. What would you say if given the room? What would you want if no one told you not to want? In your mind, you build a room, not of stone, but of words. A space where you are not a vessel, not a name on a dowry, but a voice. You see it clearly. You walk in without fear, and for the first time you speak. No one interrupts. No one turns away. You are heard. And though the world beyond your door has not changed, something within you has. You know now that silence is not the only story, that there is more, that you are more. In the Athenian mind, a woman did not own herself. She passed, instead, from one guardian to another, from father to husband, from husband to son, or, in the absence of men, to the nearest male relative. This was not considered cruelty. It was considered order. To be a woman was to be protected, managed, kept. The word for her legal status was kyrios, meaning lord or master. A man's control over a woman was not personal, it was structural. It was the shape of the law and of life. And in this world, Even marriage was less a partnership than a transaction, one that placed a woman permanently beneath a man's authority. The marriage contract was built not around love or even compatibility, but around property and inheritance. A woman brought a dowry, a sum of money, goods, or land that guaranteed her future. But this dowry was not hers. It passed into the management of her husband. If he died, she might be returned to her family like a borrowed item. If he divorced her, he was obliged to return the dowry, but the woman herself remained without power. Her consent at every stage was optional. Fathers could arrange marriages without consulting their daughters. Husbands could dissolve them without explanation. The wife's body, like her wealth, was transferred, not offered. Children, too, belonged to the father. Even in the womb, a child was assumed to carry his essence. A woman could nurture, could labor, could bleed, but the child was not hers in any legal sense. In cases of separation, she had no right to claim custody. Her role was to produce heirs, not to claim them, and if she failed to do so, she might be cast aside. A barren wife could be replaced. Her womb was judged not by the fullness of her emotions, but by its capacity to deliver sons. These structures were enforced not only through law, but through ritual. On her wedding night, a woman was led to her husband's home in a torch-lit procession, often seated on a cart, dressed in a veil that concealed her face. She crossed the threshold as a guest, and often remained one. She would live with her husband's family, under his mother's scrutiny. Her every action measured against the expectations of decency and submission. Her name rarely appeared in records. In most public documents, she was simply wife of her own identity, dissolved in the titles of others. Even within the home, her autonomy was limited. She could manage servants, oversee meals, and maintain the loom, but she could not own property independently. She could not bring legal charges. In many cases, she could not leave the house without permission. Her body was a site of legal concern. Who had touched it? Who had rights to it? Who might lay claim to it? In this way, the wife became not just a person, but a boundary. Her honor was not hers to define. It belonged to her husband, her family, her city. And yet, despite these constraints, women lived full interior lives. They whispered stories to their daughters, wrote names in the dust, prayed to goddesses with their own kind of voice. Some found joy in motherhood, in the rhythms of the hearth, in the songs they sang while grinding grain. But the shadow of ownership never lifted. Even love could not undo it. A tender husband might treat his wife with kindness, but still refer to her as mine, not in affection, but in fact. The idea that a woman might belong to herself was so foreign as to be laughable. This ownership extended even to death. Tombstones often bore a husband's inscription, noting how dutiful, how modest, how obedient the woman had been. She was praised for disappearing, for having left no mark of her own. And those who did leave marks, like the rare poetess, the rare philosopher, the rare rebel, were remembered only through scandal or myth. Their names survived because they transgressed. The rest faded, their stories buried beneath household dust. You sit now in your chamber, your fingers running along the edge of a wooden chest. Inside are your marriage tokens, a belt, a comb, a small vial of perfume. You remember your mother fastening the belt around your waist and whispering, "You belong now." You had not understood then what she meant, but you do now. The word belong had two meanings, one of affection and one of ownership. And in this house, only one of them was real. You rise slowly and look in the mirror. the polished bronze giving back a soft, distorted image. You see your face, yes, but you also see the layers of expectation draped around it. Daughter, wife, mother, possession. And yet, beneath them, a flicker remains of self, of agency, of quiet defiance. You do not scream, you do not break anything. But in the silence of the evening, you touch your own face and say your name. Not the one your husband calls you, not the one your father used. Your own, softly, clearly, as if you were not something to be given, but someone who has always been. In the early light of morning, Athenian women begin their careful rituals of dress. Not the flamboyant choices of the symposium courtesans, nor the plain tunics of the enslaved, but something in between, quiet, calculated restraint. A peplous pinned at the shoulders, always long enough to brush the ankles. A shawl drawn tightly, not for warmth, but for invisibility. A veil pulled over the head, shadowing the eyes from view. Every fold and fastening, every step of preparation is made not to attract attention, but to avoid it. Because to be seen too clearly is to risk accusation. To be desirable is to be dangerous, and danger, for a woman, is often punished not in court, but in silence. Adornment was never simply decoration in ancient Greece. It was a language or code of class, respectability, and submission. Wealthier women wore jewelry of gold and glass, but modestly. A single ring, a pendant hidden beneath cloth, perhaps a faint dab of perfume made from myrrh or rose. Anything more was viewed with suspicion. Too much color, too much scent, too many bangles. All these could mark a woman as frivolous, or worse, unchaste. For women of citizen families, the goal was not to shine, it was to blend, to reassure, to communicate through concealment. Beauty was a trap that had to be carefully hidden, lest it ensnare the wrong kind of gaze. Yet paradoxically, beauty was also expected. A woman should remain appealing to her husband, youthful, fresh-faced. Midwives recommended creams of honey, oils of almond, even lead-based powders to lighten the skin. The ideal Athenian woman was pale, soft, serene, her body an emblem of indoor life. To be sun-darkened was to be associated with labor, travel, or, worse, freedom. Fairness, both in skin and manner, became a virtue. But it was a virtue bound by control. To decorate oneself too freely was to risk being compared to a hetaira. To display pleasure in the act of beautifying was to expose a self-one that might want, might feel, might claim her own reflection. The veil became the most potent symbol of this dynamic. To cover the head was to show respect. To lower the eyes was to show submission. The veil marked a woman as belonging to someone, father, husband, household. And yet, the veil also concealed what men feared. It became a screen between her body and the world, a barrier between the assumed chaos of female desire and the ordered streets of the polis. Philosophers wrote that women's emotions were changeable, their bodies porous to influence. A covered woman was a guarded city. An uncovered one was a door flung open. This fear extended to sound. A woman's voice, if heard too loudly in public, could draw condemnation. A laugh that rang too freely, a song hummed in the street, these were cause for gossip, concern. Men believed that female expression could be infectious, that a well-spoken woman could seduce with words alone. Thus, the physical body was only one danger. The emotional and intellectual body, when revealed, posed another. And so women learned to fold themselves inward, to decorate only the edges of their lives, to keep the brightness low. Even the gods reinforced these lessons. Goddesses like Athena dressed in armor, chaste and severe. Artemis, too, demanded purity, flaying those who dared spy on her unclothed form. But Aphrodite was different. She did not veil, she did not blush. Her power lay in her ability to be seen and desired without apology. And yet, she was the exception that proved the rule. Her worship came with warnings. Her beauty caused wars. Her presence destabilized families. She was loved and feared precisely because she did not hide. Within the household, a woman's appearance was rarely praised. Compliments, if offered, came in the form of comparisons. She is as still as the hearth, as modest as her mother, as gentle as a lamb. There was no space in this language for fire, and yet, in the mirror's reflection, some women may have seen more. A curve that stirred pride, a glance that lingered, a secret kept not from shame, but from protection. Because to see oneself as beautiful in such a world was not vanity. It was a quiet rebellion. You sit before your own mirror now, a polished disk of bronze, catching the morning sun. Your fingers trace the delicate crease of your cheek, the line of your jaw. You do not wear perfume, but you remember its scent, amber, resin, a note of citrus. You wore it once, on your wedding night. He did not notice, or if he did, he said nothing. Since then, the bottle has remained sealed, but today, for reasons you cannot name, you open it, just a drop placed at your wrist. You close your eyes and breathe. The scent rises, not to seduce, but to remind that you are not only a function, that your body, veiled and brushed and dressed in the dark, is still yours. That beneath the modest layers, beneath the words not said, there is still light. Not too bright, just enough to warm the skin. And in that warmth, you remember, to want to be seen is not a sin. To be beautiful, even quietly, even just for yourself, is not shameful. It is human. It is yours. In the painted silence of ceramic vases, desire spoke more openly than it did in the streets of Athens. On the glossy surface of craters and kylix's cups, used at the symposium, artists sketched the contours of human longing. Men reclining with flute girls, courtesans bending gracefully to pour wine, lovers caught medembris. Some images were suggestive, others explicit. There were scenes of gods seducing mortals, satyrs chasing nymphs, and even glimpses of women alone combing their hair, gazing into mirrors, reclining with a certain softness that implied more than rest. These images were not confined to the private world. They were traded, displayed, poured from, held in hand. In a society where respectable women's desire was never spoken aloud, it was immortalized in clay. Erotic art in Greece existed on a strange border between the accepted and the forbidden. It was not hidden, yet it was not discussed openly among the virtuous. The symposium was the primary stage for such imagery, a place where men could indulge in fantasies, both literal and symbolic. The scenes allowed them to play with power, with roles, with ideas of femininity that were fluid and safe, because the women depicted were not real. They were muses, myths, fragments. Their pleasure, when shown, was stylized. Parted lips, arched backs, exaggerated forms. They were not wives. They were something else, subjects of projection. Still, these images reveal a culture deeply preoccupied with the body, with sex, with performance. And within that, we can catch glimpses faint but persistent of how female pleasure was both acknowledged and denied. A woman lifting her robe, a hand slipping between her thighs, a tilted head suggesting bliss. These were signs of something unspeakable, yet constantly seen. They allowed men to imagine a woman's desire, but only through their own lens. A woman might be shown climaxing, but only in a way that affirmed the viewer's control. Her pleasure was shaped to fit a fantasy. It was not hers to own. Wives rarely appeared in these scenes. When they did, they were modest, still seated in domestic space. Their erotic selves were invisible, and yet some women saw these images. Servants setting the symposium table, daughters passing through the workshop of a vase painter, a wife cleaning a cup the morning after a gathering. They would glimpse the swirl of limbs, the open mouths, the softness of lines that suggested touch. They would not speak of it, but they would remember. Outside of pottery, eroticism surfaced in poetry and plays, often in comic form. Aristophanes, the great comic playwright, laced his works with sexual innuendo, jokes about women's hunger for sex, their tricks, their endless appetites. These were not flattering portrayals, but they hinted at a truth the culture refused to fully name, that women too had bodies that longed. The comedy made it safe to laugh. It also made it easier to dismiss, to turn real desire into a punchline. And yet there were more serious voices. The poet Sappho, writing from the island of Lesbos, composed verses that trembled with tenderness. She spoke of longing with another woman, not just for her touch, but for her laughter, her glance, her voice. Her poems are fragments now, torn by time, but they remain some of the most honest expressions of female desire in the ancient world. They do not flatter men, they do not hide, they sing softly, but without shame. And though few in Athens would have read her lines aloud, the truth in them remains. Even sculpture, in its cold stillness, holds shadows of intimacy. A reclining woman, her robe slipping just slightly from her shoulder. A goddess bathing, startled by a gaze. A mortal caught in the moment before she turns to meet a lover's hand. These poses invite the viewer in, but they also conceal. The Greeks never fully depicted the female orgasm in their art. It was always a suggestion, never a declaration. To show it would be to admit its power, and that they could not bear. You pass such a vase now, on a shelf in the corner of your husband's study. It is meant to hold wine, but it has not been used in years. The figures painted, their two lovers, entwined in a dance of limbs, stare back at you with knowing eyes. You trace the curve of the woman's hip with your gaze. Her mouth is open. Her hand rests against the man's shoulder, not pulling, not pushing, just being. You wonder what she felt. You wonder if the artist knew. You wonder if any man ever asked. Later, when the house sleeps and the shutters are drawn, you lie awake in the dark and picture her again. Not the vase, but the woman, the shape of her breath, the weight of her want. You imagine her not in clay, but in flesh, not for him, for herself. And in that imagining, you discover something you did not expect: recognition. Your body, so long held in silence, remembers what it means to feel. Not for display, not for duty, but for the simple, sacred fact of being alive. In the world of ancient Greece, what could not be explained was often mythologized, and when it came to the female orgasm, its existence, its purpose, its consequences, explanation was evasive, and myth stepped in to fill the gap. Philosophers, physicians, and poets all circled the topic, describing female pleasure with cautious language or not at all. Yet in the myths, the stories told around fires, on stages, in whispered versus female desire, erupted with startling frequency. It transformed, devoured, punished, and prophesied. These stories betrayed an uncomfortable truth. The Greeks knew female pleasure existed, but they could not decide what to do with it. Take the story of Tiresias. As myth tells it, Tiresias was once transformed into a woman for 7 years. During that time, he experienced sex from a female perspective. Later, when asked by Zeus and Hera who felt more pleasure, man or woman, he answered, 10 parts for the woman, 1 for the man. For this insight, Hera struck him blind. The myth is strange and often retold with laughter, but beneath it lies a persistent anxiety that women feel more, want more, and therefore must be kept in check. The truth, Tiresias revealed, was not denied, it was punished. This pattern plays out in other tales. Pasiphae, wife of King Minos, is cursed to lust for a bulla, desire that results in the birth of the Minotaur. Her story is grotesque, exaggerated, turned into a lesson about unnatural passion. Yet beneath its surface is the idea of a woman whose desire, left unguarded, leads to monstrosity. Then there is Phaedra, who falls in love with her stepson and, when rejected, accuses him falsely, leading to tragedy. Again, female longing is framed as disease, violent, irrational, consuming. These stories reflect a culture that was simultaneously fascinated by and terrified of women who felt deeply. Greek physicians offered their own interpretations. The Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of medical writings, described women as being more prone to imbalance due to their moist and porous bodies. The uterus was imagined as a creature within a separate, living organ that could become agitated if denied sex. This theory, called the wandering womb, became a cornerstone of gynecological thought. A woman who experienced hysteria, term derived from hystera. The Greek word for womb was not seen as emotional, but as physically disordered. Her cure, controlled intercourse, ideally resulting in pregnancy. Orgasm, if it occurred, was tolerated only within this framework. Pleasure outside of procreation was not acknowledged as legitimate. There were some exceptions. Galen, writing in the 2nd century, acknowledged that women might need to climax to conceive. He even described signs of female arousal in clinical terms. But his recognition was cautious, technical, stripped of emotion. He wrote of swelling, of heat, of rhythmic motion, but not of joy, not of choice. The medical world never fully embraced the idea of women as autonomous agents of desire. Their pleasure was always tethered to someone else's goal, a child, a cure, a husband's peace of mind. This repression had real consequences. Women were taught to distrust their bodies, to interpret pleasure as weakness or sin. They were not educated in their anatomy. Many had no names for what they felt, no language for desire. What could not be named could not be defended. And so, many lived without knowing that their experiences were shared, that the ache they felt was not madness, but a form of knowledge denied them by design. But myths are not only warnings, they are also records of what a culture cannot suppress. The story of Daphne, who transforms into a tree to escape Apollo's pursuit, might be read as a tale of chastity, but it is also a story of refusal, of a woman who chooses silence over surrender, transformation over submission, and the story of Aphrodite and Anchises, where the goddess seduces a mortal man, offers a rare glimpse of female pleasure initiated by the woman, even if it ends with divine punishment. These moments are rare, but they gleam like embers in ash. Even in comedy, the female orgasm was not wholly erased. In Aristophanes' Lysistrata, women withhold sex to force men to negotiate peace. The play is bawdy, exaggerated, but it hints at a truth that women's sexual power, if organized, could shift the course of history. The audience laughed, perhaps uneasily, recognizing the truth behind the farce. In those moments, female pleasure was not just possible, it was potent. You lie awake tonight, your body curled beneath linen, your thoughts restless. You remember the stories told to you as a child of goddesses and monsters, of loyalty and shame. You were taught to admire Athena for her wisdom, to fear Hera for her jealousy, to dismiss Aphrodite as frivolous. No one told you that these women, divine or not, were fragments of yourself. No one told you that your longing had a lineage. In the dark, you shift slightly, your hand brushing your belly. You think of the physicians and their instruments, of the myths that called desire a curse, of the laughter in the theater when a woman dared to want, and then, quietly, you ask the question they all tried to bury. What if it isn't sickness? What if it isn't sin? What if your pleasure long buried, long feared is simply part of being whole? And with that thought, you exhale, not in defiance, not in shame, but in peace. Because for the first time, you do not push the feeling away. You let it stay, and it does not burn. It warms. In the sacred groves and marble temples of ancient Greece, the divine was everywhere. Gods dwelled in trees, in rivers, in wind. They watched from mountaintops and descended to touch the world with fire or favor. Religion was not separate from daily life, was its fabric. Yet even in this deeply spiritual culture, the body, especially the female body, remained a contested site. Women were both vessels of the sacred and sources of suspicion. Their fertility was honored. Their desire was feared. Nowhere was this paradox more visible than in the worship of virgin goddesses and in the rituals that surrounded women's bodies. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, stood at the heart of Athenian identity. She was born from the head of Zeus, fully armed, without the stain of birth or the softness of a mother's touch. She was Parthenos, the eternal virgin. Her temple, the Parthenon, crowned the Acropolis, a symbol of reason, order, and restraint. In Athena, the Greeks celebrated a woman stripped of sexuality, made powerful not through desire but through its absence. She was revered precisely because she did not want. Her purity made her safe, admirable, even masculine. The women of Athens were expected to emulate her modest, serious, untouchable. Then there was Artemis, goddess of the hunt and the moon, sister to Apollo. She, too, was a virgin, roaming wild forests with her band of maidens, far from the touch of men. Her punishments were swift and cruel. When Actaeon accidentally saw her bathing, she transformed him into a stag, and he was torn apart by his own hounds. When one of her followers broke her vow of chastity, Artemis killed her without mercy. This was the lesson. To remain pure was to remain powerful. To succumb to desire was to invite ruin. In these stories, virginity became not only a virtue, but a shield. And yet, even as these goddesses were elevated, other female deities were diminished. Demeter, the nurturing mother, wept for her daughter Persephone, who was abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld. When Persephone ate the seeds of the pomegranate, symbol of sexual awakening, she was bound to return to the underworld each year. Her story, told in the Eleusinian mysteries, was one of sorrow, of seasonal death and rebirth, but it was also a metaphor for the cost of female desire. Even in myth, to taste was to fall, to feel was to be changed forever. Rituals reflected these tensions. Young girls participated in ceremonies like the Arcada, where they played the bear for Artemis. marking their transition from childhood to womanhood. In these rites, they danced, sang, and symbolically shed their innocence. But the rituals were not celebrations of sexuality. They were precautions meant to guide the girl safely through a dangerous threshold. Puberty was viewed as a perilous moment. A girl who began to menstruate was no longer a child, but not yet a wife. She was vulnerable, both to desire and to danger. The rites existed to discipline the body, to remind it of its proper path. In temple spaces, women were often barred from priesthoods or relegated to subordinate roles. Exceptions existed, of course. The Pythia, the oracle at Delphi, spoke for Apollo. Certain cults, like those of Demeter and Persephone, were women-led. But even here, power came through suppression. The Pythia fasted, purified herself, and entered trances. Her words were not hers, they were the gods'. She was a vessel, not a speaker. Female authority, when granted, was always mediated. It was always conditional. Marriage itself was religious in nature. Weddings involved libations, sacrifices, and blessings from Hera, goddess of marriage. Yet these rituals rarely invoked love. The focus was on fertility, on transition, on order. A woman left one household for another, symbolically dying as a daughter and being reborn as a wife. In some traditions, she ate a quinceor hard, symbolic of submission. The gods were asked not to bless her happiness, but her obedience. Her pleasure was not mentioned, but even within this framework, subversive elements remained. In the shadowed corners of temples, votive offerings told quieter stories. Terracotta figurines of women with rounded bellies, pendants shaped like vulvas, inscriptions asking for help in love or conception. These were not the formal, polished prayers of civic religion. They were personal, intimate, unfiltered. They came from women whose bodies had betrayed or surprised them, who longed, feared, hoped. In these objects, we see glimpses of a spiritual life that included not just duty, but feeling. You visit such a temple one day, your sandals brushing against the stone floor, worn smooth by centuries of feet. You bring an offering olive oil in a small clay bottle, wrapped in linen. You do not speak as you kneel, but your thoughts are loud. You think of Athena and how she never wept. You think of Artemis and how she never touched. You think of Persephone and how a single taste changed her forever. You do not know which of them you are. You only know that your body holds a story no priest has ever heard. As you leave, you pass a statue's, mall-worn, but still lovely. A woman seated, her hand resting on her chest, her face serene. She is not a goddess, she is not named, but someone carved her, someone lit a candle at her feet. And in her stillness, you see something you recognize. Not shame, not silence, but knowing. She does not speak. She does not need to. She is whole. In the dusty scrolls of ancient libraries, where the thoughts of Greek physicians lay inked in methodical rows, one finds the beginnings of what would become gynecology. It was not yet a science, not in the way we understand it now. It was part philosophy, part observation, part imagination, and above all, it was shaped by men who had never seen a living uterus, who did not know ovulation from spirits, who built an entire theory of the female body on metaphor, modesty, and myth. The goal was not to understand women, it was to manage them. The foundation of Greek gynecological thought was the belief that the female body was a flawed version of the male. Where the male was dry, hot, firm, and outward, the female was moist, cool, soft, and inward. The uterus, they believed, was the defining organ of the female, both biologically and morally. Its health determined her temperament, her sanity, even her worth. If it misbehaved, so would she. If it was satisfied through sex, pregnancy, and childbirth, then she might remain balanced. But if it was neglected, it would wander. It would choke her, smother her, rise to her brain, and drive her mad. This theory, so often repeated in Hippocratic texts, led to treatments that were both invasive and dismissive. Women were instructed to lie with their husbands, more often not for love or pleasure, but to keep the uterus grounded. If they showed signs of hysteria, shortness of breath, anxiety, sudden tears, they were often diagnosed with uterine suffocation. Remedies included fumigations, pessaries, and oils. Some doctors recommended sweet scents near the vulva and foul odors near the nose to coax the womb back into place. Others believed manual stimulation might help, though always under the guise of medicine, not intimacy. The idea of female pleasure did appear in these writings, but only as a tool. Some physicians believed that women must climax in order to conceive. Others disagreed. But in either case, the woman's sensation was never seen as hers. It was a means to an end. If she failed to conceive, it was her fault. Perhaps she had not enjoyed it enough. If she wept during intercourse, perhaps she was frigid. If she resisted, perhaps her womb had become wild. The entire system was rigged against her, diagnosing her with the consequences of her own confinement. No illustrations of the clitoris appear in Greek medical texts. No diagrams of the female pelvis. The anatomy was speculative, drawn from animal dissection and male analogies. The woman was imagined as a man turned inside out. Her reproductive organs were shadows of his, reversed and hidden. Pleasure, in this framework, was secondary, mysterious, suspicious. And so, women were not educated in their own function. They were expected to feel what they were told to feel, and nothing more. Midwives existed, of course, and many women likely turned to them for practical help. These were older women, often experienced in childbirth, bleeding, and recovery. Their knowledge was tactile, passed hand to hand, not written in scrolls. They rubbed bellies, caught babies, soothed with herbs, but their voices did not survive. The male physician, cloaked in status and scrolls, claimed authority. Even when he never set foot in a birthing room, even when his cures failed, his words endured. And so, the birth of gynecology was not a moment of enlightenment. It was a moment of appropriation. Still, women adapted. They swallowed the infusions. They lay still when told. Some whispered alternative methods to one another. In corners, how to end a pregnancy with rue or pennyroyal. How to ease bleeding with wool soaked in wine. Their knowledge flowed quietly beneath the marble surface of Greek medicine. But it remained unofficial, unwritten. You sit on a low stool now, watching a servant girl pour water over the midwife's hands. Your belly has ached for days. No blood has come. You know what they will say. You must lie with your husband again. You must be cured with warmth and seed. But you do not want warmth. You do not want seed. You want to know your own body, not through diagnosis, but through truth. You want to ask, what is this pain? Where does it come from? Is it the womb? Or is it the years of silence pressing inward, blooming into ache? The midwife looks at you gently. She touches your wrist, not to check your pulse, but to ground you. She says nothing, but her eyes hold more knowledge than the physician's scrolls ever could. You wonder if she knows what you feel, not just the discomfort, but the shame of not knowing, the grief of not having words for what your body carries. And in that moment, something shifts. You realize the betrayal was never your body. It was the system that refused to teach you its name. The system that made your pleasure taboo, your pain invisible, your knowledge suspect. And so you begin, quietly, to reclaim it. Not in defiance, not in anger, but in recognition that this body is not a mystery, it is not a failure, it is not a shadow of something better, it is yours, and that is enough. Long after the last philosophers left the agora and the temples crumbled to ruin, the Greek vision of the female body lived on. It passed through parchment and prayer, through medieval medicine and Renaissance art, through whispered instructions to young brides and the locked drawers of doctors' offices. The wandering womb was renamed hysteria. The hierarchy of male and female seed was rephrased in Latin, but the core belief endured, that female pleasure was dangerous, that it needed to be denied, redirected, or cured. Greece fell, but its shadow remained. In the Roman world, these beliefs solidified. Roman physicians borrowed Greek texts wholesale. Galen's teachings, particularly, survived for centuries. He had accepted that women had a capacity for orgasm, but he framed it as a mirror to the male, a biological echo, not a thing of its own. In the Roman household, as in Athens, the ideal woman was modest, fertile, and chaste. Her sexuality belonged to her husband. Her pleasure, if mentioned, was indulgent at best, suspicious at worst. The Latin term for modesta pudicitiabu came synonymous with virtue, and where it was absent, law and violence often stepped in. As Christianity took hold, these notions deepened and calcified. Early church fathers, trained in Greek philosophy, viewed the body as a source of sin, and the female body as doubly so. Augustine, once a man of passion, repented and wrote extensively about the dangers of lust. Jerome warned that even in marriage, sex was perilous, virginity was elevated. Mary, untouched and serene, became the most honored woman in Christian tradition. Her purity was not just spiritual, it was anatomical. She was the anti-Aphrodite. And in this framework, female desire was cast further into shadow. Throughout the medieval period, women were taught to associate their bodies with shame. The medical writings of the time, often still quoting Hippocrates or Galen, suggested that an unruly uterus could still cause illness. Bleeding was suspect. Sexual dreams were signs of possession. Women who expressed too much longing were accused of witchcraft. Those who desired knowledge of herbs and healing were burned. Their understanding of fertility, of pain, of pleasure gathered through generations was called heresy. The Church, now guardian of moral and physical health, reasserted what the Greeks had feared, that a woman who knew her own body was dangerous. But cracks appeared. In poetry, the courtly love tradition emerged. Troubadours sang of women who stirred not just loyalty, but lust. These women were noble, intelligent, emotionally complex, and though the love was often unconsummated, the longing was real. The body returned to the page not as a site of sin, but of desire. Later, during the Renaissance, artists sculpted and painted the nude female form with reverence. But again, the gaze was male. The pleasure was presumed to be his. Even in celebration, the woman's desire was posed, not expressed. It was not until the Enlightenment that thinkers began to seriously challenge ancient ideas. Anatomy advanced. Dissection revealed that the clitoris was not a defect or a leftover, but an organ in its own right. Still, doctors debated its purpose. Some claimed it caused hysteria if stimulated too much. Others argued it served no purpose at all. Manuals for women advised them to focus on their husband's needs. Masturbation, for both sexes, was condemned, but for women it was especially shameful, an act of trespass into a realm she was never meant to control. The 19th century brought both progress and regression. Freud theorized that clitoral pleasure was immature, and that true female fulfillment could only come through vaginal orgasm within heterosexual marriage. Of course, hysteria remained a diagnosis for women who exhibited symptoms outside the norm. Anxiety, sexuality, emotion. The cure, famously, was sometimes orgasm administered by a physician's hand or an early mechanical device. But even this was not framed as pleasure, it was a treatment. The body remained something done to, not something that could speak for itself. You read these histories now, piecing them together from borrowed scrolls and whispered stories. You see how the pattern repeats, how the myth of the dangerous female orgasm survived across empires and centuries. It was always the same argument. If a woman could feel for herself, she might think for herself. If she thought, she might speak. If she spoke, she might refuse. And if she refused, she would cease to be useful to the city, to the church, to the family. Better to call her mad. Better to call her modest. Better to erase the question. But the question remains. You carry it with you as you walk through the garden, your hands brushing rosemary and thyme. You think of your mother, who never spoke of pleasure. You think of your daughter, still too young to ask, and you wonder, when will the silence break? When will the story change? It has already begun. In hidden journals, in secret meetings, in glances exchanged between women who recognize something unspoken in one another. The old gods are gone, but the truths buried beneath their altars still stir, not loudly, not violently, but with certainty. The knowledge that your body is not a curse, that your longing is not a flaw, that your pleasure, denied for so long, is not dangerous. It is yours. And when the wind rises tonight, passing through the open windows and across your skin, you do not flinch. You let it in, like breath, like song, like a voice long silenced, now returned. The walls are quiet now. The house sleeps, its chambers dark and still, its hearth grown cold. You lie alone, the linen sheets gathered at your waist, and the shadows stretch long across the ceiling. But you are not afraid. Something ancient stirs not, outside, but within. Not a memory exactly, but something older. A murmur passed down in blood. The echo of hands that worked the loom. Bodies that bore children. Voices that were hushed but never lost. A knowledge that once dared to rise, and was pressed down again and again, but never completely buried. Not in Athens, not in Rome, not in cloisters or clinics or textbooks. It survived. Because pleasure, even when forbidden, finds its way. It lives in glances exchanged over water jars. In the heat of summer air, under layers of wool. In the curl of a lip, when no one is watching. It passes in stories slippery, coded, clothed in metaphor. It rides on the rhythm of lullabies, the sighs behind shuttered windows, the laughter muffled behind market stalls. They tried to ban it, diagnose it, legislate it, but it slipped through anyway, because it was never theirs to own. It belonged to the body, and the body remembers, even when language fails, even when shame crowds out breath, even when the only word offered to describe it is wrong. The body remembers. It remembers the thrill of touch, the ache of want, the strange electricity of being seen. And it remembers, too, the sorrow of being silenced, the small deaths of permission withheld. But still it waits, patient as bone, ready, always, to rise again. You breathe deeply, letting your chest fill. You remember the girls at the well, the way they looked at one another when the men were not near. You remember the story of Sappho, how her poems were nearly lost, burned or neglected, reduced to ash, but a scrap remained, a single line found in the wrappings of a mummy pressed between papyrus and dust. Her voice reaching through time like a hand, saying, "Still, I was here, I felt this, I named it, I dared." You wonder how many others never spoke, how many women lived whole lives in silence, how many dismissed their own sensations as error, as confusion, as guilt, how many turned their faces from mirrors, unable to claim the reflection as their own. And yet, even in their stillness, they left something behind, a resonance, a possibility. You feel it now, like warmth at the base of the spine, like a pulse just beneath the skin. The house creaks, a sparrow chirps from the roof tile. You shift beneath the covers, no longer cold. You think of Artemis and Aphrodite, of Athena and Persephone. You think of the goddesses who did not apologize. You think of the lovers whose names were never carved in stone, but who lived anyway, who felt anyway. And you realize this history is not dead. It moves, it breathes, it lies next to you now, curled like a cat in the crook of your arm. There is no need for noise, no grand gesture. The revolution is small, it is quiet, it is made of breath, of choice, of recognition. You touch your own wrist, feel the beat there, steady and sure. You do not need anyone to tell you what it means. You do not need a philosopher's scroll, a doctor's note, a priest's blessing. You already know. Tonight you will sleep. Not because you have been tamed, not because the world made room for your rest, but because you took it, you claimed it. You let your body soften, your mind unfurl, your breath deepen. And in that sleep, you will carry not shame, but a secret joy. Not because they gave it to you, but the moonlight washes across the floor like silver water. You close your eyes. Somewhere far off, a wind stirs the leaves of an olive tree. The house exhales, and you, still warm, whole let go. You dream not of gods or punishment. You dream of hands that meet, of words that bloom, of a world where silence does not choke but cradles, where to feel is not to fear, where pleasure is not a weapon but a home. You sleep, and in your sleep the story lives on.